Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's present here today. Yes. Thank you. Okay, is that good? Okay. So just to reiterate my thanks to everyone who's present here today for this press conference. I'm going to go through some of the main points from the preliminary observations from the 10-day visit that I've undertaken here in Colombia. I started my visit in Bogota. I've been to Cúcuta, Medellin, Cali, and Barranquilla. And this has been vitally important because it's clear that in each region, there are very distinct experiences that people face as LGBT persons in those regions. These are preliminary observations with limited recommendations. The full report will be presented to the Human Rights Council in June of 2026. And that would include a more detailed set of specific recommendations to the state. Now, clearly, the backdrop to these preliminary observations is the fact that there's a very robust policy framework within Colombia. The Constitutional Court has taken enormous strides in protecting the rights of LGBT people, and yet Colombia remains a country of profound contrast and contradictions. And a significant gap exists between the aspirational commitments of the 1991 Constitution and prevailing social attitudes and practices. And this disconnect leads to experience of discrimination and, in extreme forms, violence directed against LGBT people. And during the course of my visit, I received the deeply disturbing news of the murder of Noa Jimenez, a trans woman human rights defender who was one of some 43 LGBT individuals who'd been killed in Colombia so far in 2025 at the time of writing. And in the previous year, 2024, some 164 LGBT persons were killed, according to the statistics from Caribe Afirmativo. And this contrasts with the official statistics from the ombudsperson of 52 persons murdered during 2024. And this discrepancy underscores a gap in quantitative data, which is something that I go into in these preliminary observations. But nevertheless, the murder of Noa illustrates a deeply concerning pattern of violence directed against LGBT people, and particularly against trans women in Colombia. So this persistent gap between constitutional aspirations and lived realities, compounded by impunity for violent crimes, is indeed a source of deep frustration for almost everybody who I spoke to, whether those are affected communities, national, regional, and municipal authorities, human rights institutions, and law enforcement agencies. And this leads me to conclude that there is a need for a new set of indicators that are developed in close collaboration with civil society that measure the actual impacts of law and policy in different key sectors, such as health and education, while also accounting for the differences in territory and population-based disparities. So given these widespread differences, diversity of experience across geographies, histories, and identities, it would be inaccurate to talk in general about the situation in Colombia, or indeed in general about the situation for LGBT people, because these vary so considerably across context. Whether it's rural or urban, whether it's people directly affected by armed conflict, whether we are looking at the experience of migrants or LGBTQ women or trans persons or indigenous communities, or Afro-Caribbean population, or sex workers. All of these experiences are distinct, and I was very fortunate to be able to travel around the country to get some sense of the differences that were experienced across regions and from different groups with whom we were able to meet, and who very generously gave of their time and expertise. So just to look at the national, regional, and global context in which this report is produced, clearly the Constitutional Court, as I have mentioned, has played a very significant role in protecting the rights of LGBT persons. Through tutelar actions, there's some 800 rulings that strengthen protections for LGBT individuals. And these rulings have been used to address police violence against trans women, sex workers, to advance rights such as same-sex marriage and adoption, and in addition to combat discrimination and violence against LGBT persons in health, education, employment, and the prison system. It's also protected students from bullying and addressed workplace discrimination. Indeed, there are ongoing efforts to address structural discrimination, including the draft comprehensive trans law and legislative attempts to curb so-called conversion practices. The National Development Plan of 2022 to 2026 includes concrete measures to advance LGBT rights, and the establishment of the Ministry of Equality and Equity marked a significant milestone in terms of attempts to coordinate and address structural inequalities and promote the rights of marginalized groups, including LGBT people. Colombia's national policy for the guarantee of the rights of the LGBTIQ+ population, Compass 4147, that was approved in March 2025, indeed provides a 10-year roadmap for advancing rights based on sexual orientation and gender identity. It's an enormous undertaking, coordinating some 49 government entities with 167 specific actions focused on cultural transformation, equal access to services, reducing prejudice-based violence, and enhancing institutional coordination. With an investment of some 250 billion over the 10-year period. Now, it has to be said that senior representatives, both at a regional and municipal level, outlined impressive public policies, strategies, and action plans. Some challenges certainly persisted in terms of the adequate funding and implementation of public policies. These policies did address areas such as psychosocial support, legal support, sensitization of civil servants towards the needs of LGBT people, training for police and attorneys, and the establishment of working groups and advisory committees that involved affected communities. Now, in terms of the international role that Colombia plays, clearly the feminist foreign policy launched in 2023 is the cornerstone of these international initiatives. Colombia is co-chair of the Equal Rights Coalition, an alliance of some 45 states committed to promoting and protecting the rights of LGBTI persons globally, and also a member of the UN LGBTI core group. And Colombia indeed co-sponsored the 2016 Human Rights Council resolution that created the mandate that I currently occupy. And there have been various initiatives since 2019 to address violence and discrimination and promote access to justice, which are outlined in some detail in the preliminary observation. Clearly, one of the compounding factors in Colombia is those areas that are most affected by non-state armed groups and criminal organizations. And in those areas, the absence of institutional protection, which leads to many LGBT people fleeing from those areas in search of safety. And these groups very often impose strict moral codes and target gender nonconformity and same-sex relationships, which are punished through threats, physical assaults, and in some cases, targeted killings. And in this instance, LGBT human rights defenders face especially severe threats. Between 2016 and 2024, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights documented 16 killings of LGBT human rights defenders, all linked to their activism. In 2022, Colombia's Truth Commission published its final report entitled "My Body is the Truth," which examined violence against LGBT persons. According to the single registry of victims, some 5,890 individuals identifying as LGBTI have been officially registered as victims of the armed conflict. And Colombia's transitional justice system is the first globally to adopt a gender-sensitive approach that explicitly includes violations against LGBT persons. And the important macro case 11 on sexual violence during armed conflict, which looks at prejudice-motivated violence against LGBT persons, will be a significant aspect of the transitional justice process, although civil society groups have expressed some concern about the limited time frame allocated for the investigation of this significant case. LGBT migrants and refugees, and particularly Venezuelan trans women, face specific challenges, routine forms of severe violence, including trafficking and sexual abuse and exploitation. LGBT women in Colombia also experience gender-based violence in multiple settings, which in my interaction with the various groups representing LGBT women have pointed to the underlying structural issues such as patriarchal, homophobic, and transphobic norms that underpin their vulnerability, exacerbated by conditions of poverty, by racism, and by displacement. And despite some advances in terms of political participation, including the election of mayors and other representatives, LGBT candidates face threats, stigmatization, and aspects of political exclusion, which have a negative effect on full political participation. LGBT individuals and civil society groups consistently expressed mistrust in institutions. And what was the basis of that mistrust? It was, generally speaking, a fear of re-victimization, of impunity, and of failures to deliver justice. Reports also highlighted the involvement of some police and military personnel in perpetrating or enabling violence, particularly against trans women and sex workers. An area that I focus on in the preliminary observations are data gaps. And a lack of reliable census data. According to the National Administration Department of Statistics, they estimate some 500,000 adults who self-identify as LGBT. But authorities and civil society organizations expressed concern regarding the gaps in the documentation of gender-based violence and suggest that there's significant underreporting in this area. The preliminary observations touches on socioeconomic rights, including education, specifically bullying in school. And while there are policies in place to ensure that bullying doesn't take place, there are issues again with implementation. And high dropout rates and exclusion from educational spaces often lead to long-term life consequences for LGBT individuals in terms of accessing employment, etc., and so compounding existing marginalizations that already exist. The observations also look at employment and look at the official statistics, which show a higher labor force participation, but also higher unemployment rates for LGBT people. And some of the challenges that have been cited in the labor sphere are social stigma, educational exclusion, and discriminatory stereotypes. Economically marginalized LGBT people often work in the informal sector, and this can be a source of vulnerability too, because it heightens the risk of exploitation, including survival sex work and trafficking, particularly when also affected by poverty or irregular migration status. In addition, the preliminary observations touches on issues related to health, prejudice within the healthcare sector, including some concern about conversion practices, notwithstanding the fact that the Colombian Association of Psychiatry has publicly and emphatically denounced practices, such practices as scientifically unfounded and medically unjustifiable. A particular concern has been expressed about access for trans persons to healthcare. And a new national protocol in this regard is anticipated by the end of 2020. In terms of housing, for those LGBT individuals who are economically marginalized, access to safe, affordable, and inclusive housing has been a persistent challenge. Very often at regional and municipal levels, authorities cited budgetary constraints as one of the difficulties in securing adequate housing for LGBT persons. But there were also positive examples, for example, in Bogota, their shelter strategy. But again, that has been an adequately resourced initiative within the city of Bogota. But also in the Atlantico region, some 300 LGBT-led families have secured housing through that means. So that is in some overview of some of the key issues raised in the preliminary observations and some of the findings. And then while I don't go into detailed recommendations, I do suggest areas in which there will be future recommendations. And so one of those is to ensure a coordinated institutional response to the systemic violence against LGBT persons. I think that's the most critical issue that came out of this visit. Strengthening disaggregated data collection systems so that there's accurate data on which to work and to address the kinds of challenges that are outlined in the observations. I've specifically mentioned an impartial investigation into the murder of Noah, but that is also in the context of recognition that transgender persons are disproportionately targeted for violence and the very high number of killings that have taken place. I also recommend to deepen meaningful and substantive civil society engagement in the development and implementation of policies so that there's a real sense of ownership of the policies that do exist. And very importantly, the practical matter of the adequate allocation of resources to ensure that policies can be effectively implemented. And then to think about and to adopt a set of indicators that reflect the actual reality and effect on the ground of the various policies that are in place. And finally, to take urgent steps to ensure that access to quality healthcare is widely available to trans persons. So just to sum up, I've illustrated that there's a very strong policy framework. Clearly, there's a strong political will, but there's also a profound contrast between policy and lived experience on the ground. And LGBT people very often continue to experience exclusion, marginalization, and in severe cases, violence. And a lot of this is to do with deep-seated structural discrimination, compounded, of course, by the enduring aspects of armed conflict. And addressing this disparity between legal progress and lived experiences remains one of the most urgent human rights challenges facing this country. And in that respect, it's very important to recognize the leadership of LGBT individuals in Colombia's territories who've played such a vital role in local survival strategies and advancing rights, and that the authorities could learn a lot from these groups. So high levels of violence, particularly against trans persons, need to be addressed in the context of the progressive legal and policy framework, and reiterating a call for a new generation of data and indicators that capture the real impact of laws and policies across populations and regions in areas such as healthcare, education, and justice. And only with such tools can states ensure that commitments to equality are not only symbolic, but also translate into meaningful, measurable progress in the lives of LGBT persons. Thank you.
Gracias, Experto Independiente. Por favor, para las preguntas, se identifica con su nombre y el nombre del que representa. Voy a empezar con
Bueno, muchas gracias, Iván Cruz, de RTBC, la Radio Nacional de Colombia. Usted acaba de decir que en Colombia hay un gran marco jurídico, pero que la realidad de defensa para la comunidad LGTBI, pero que la realidad es otra en las calles y en los territorios. ¿Cuál es la enfermedad de fondo en la sociedad colombiana para que los expriman tanto?
Thank you. Look, I think clearly there's a good legal and policy framework in place that is recognized in the region and also internationally, but a gap in terms of the implementation. I think some of these issues are to do with deep-rooted social and cultural, the need for long-term social and cultural change, and exacerbated by the armed conflict. So in some senses, I think that there are no easy solutions to be addressing some of the perennial issues of discrimination and violence, because they're quite deep-rooted and require this long-term cultural change. So what I'm suggesting in the report is additional steps that can be taken towards that long-term goal of social and cultural change that could serve to eliminate discrimination and violence. But I would think it would be naive to think that that could happen easily and overnight. I think the policy framework provides the tools for that. I think that they are inadequately resourced. And I think that deeper engagement with civil society organizations, both in the development and implementation of that policy, could be helpful in addressing these systemic issues around enduring discrimination and violence. But it does seem to me that there's a gap between the ideals that are represented in the policies and the various constitutional court decisions around protection and social attitudes within the country. And so that gap leads to the situation of discrimination and, as I say, in its extreme form, in violence, compounded by the enduring elements of armed conflict and illegal armed groups.
Buenos días para todos. Juan Alejandro Hernández de Noticias Urgentes. El país conoció pues lo que fue el caso de Sara Miguel y de Nahua Jiménez, como ustedes lo verificaron en el informe. Hay un subregistro. En ese recorrido que usted hizo por las regiones, ¿hay algo que le llamó la atención, que le manifestó la comunidad en las diferentes poblaciones que usted recorrió, que nos pueda manifestar que la situación puede crecer o vaya a una situación mucho más preocupante? ¿Qué sitio de lo que ustedes observaron en el terreno?
I think what was striking to me in my engagement with civil society organizations across the various areas that I visited was an extraordinarily detailed analysis of what the situation was, a deep-rooted experience, and clearly there's a reliance on civil society organizations in terms of the kind of data. You mentioned that these that there's an underreporting in terms of discrimination and violence, and civil society groups have played an indispensable role in terms of keeping that data. And in many senses, those groups are well placed to do so precisely because they're closely connected to those communities. I had a sense from my engagement with many of the civil society groups of a sense of crisis around the high levels of violence. I also had a sense of a resilience and a determination that these issues would be addressed both at a local and regional level, and a wish to have a deeper engagement from the state, specifically in the form of adequate resources that would enable the very good policies to be implemented in practice. So those were some of the impressions that I got. And I would just like to emphasize that, I was very fortunate to meet with specific groups who have particular kinds of challenges. So whether that's migrants who face their own issues around documentation, for example, or indigenous communities who find themselves excluded from their own communities and are living in a situation of limbo, for example, or the kinds of experiences of Afro-Caribbean communities and the specific experiences of LGBTQ women. Those experiences were very clearly articulated to me. That was testimony to the depth of engagement of these groups with the communities with whom they work.
Buen día, estoy usuario de Sociedad Press. Gracias por el espacio. Quisiera profundizar justamente en la violencia hacia migrantes, para migrantes, especialmente porque en el informe se nombra que ustedes pudieron documentar que puede haber planos degradantes, detenciones a esas personas, con el agravante de que denuncien actividad por grupos armados de la ley. Quisiera saber, primero, ustedes pudieron conocer casos de víctimas directas o que estos se refirieron grupos defensores de derechos humanos, cómo tuvieron información y se pudieron documentar algunos casos, entonces cuando ocurrió, sigue ocurriendo todavía y si pudiéramos saber en qué región de Colombia.
These observations came from meetings with different groups who are directly involved in working with migrants, and especially through the trip to Cucuta, where that was the focus of that meeting, engaging with different entities who had direct experience. So I didn't meet with people who had themselves experienced what I describe in the report, but I did meet with a number of groups who had direct experience of working closely with migrants and documenting those kinds of experiences that in many instances related to an absence of documentation, which is compounded for trans people because their identity documents don't match their gender identity. So those were the key issues that were highlighted in that report.
Una pregunta adicional. Una pregunta adicional. Ok. ¿Cuál es el patrón de violencia que muestra el caso del asesinato de Nahuatl Jiménez? Que es el nombre científico por la cara. Quiero ver los sellos.
Yes, I think it's emblematic in three aspects. The one is the targeting of trans individuals, particularly trans women. And secondly, the targeting of human rights defenders and how those elements came together in the context of an overarching violence directed against LGBT people. So that would be the third dimension. But that element of targeted attacks on human rights defenders in general and to a certain extent also LGBT human rights defenders, and compounded by attacks on trans women.
Buenas tardes para todos. Yo soy Santiago Cultural, noticias sobre dos preguntas gestores. Uno, hablando en el informe de un fortalecimiento de las leyes de políticas, existen proyectos de ley que buscan esos comportamientos antidiscriminatorios para la comunidad LGBTI, entonces, ¿cómo hacerlo a nivel social? Yo sé que siempre que existan proyectos de sí socialmente, creo que somos los que finalmente estamos violentando a las personas de la comunidad. Eso, y lo segundo, a raíz de su visita y de su recorrido, ¿cuáles fueron esas ciudades que encontraron más seguras para la población LGBTI y específicamente para la población de estas cities?
I think you're pointing to the heart of my preliminary observations, in fact, is that there are very positive legislative developments, there's very positive policy, but that doesn't necessarily translate into practice on the ground. And it's that discrepancy that I see as the key challenge for Colombia to address these questions of discrimination and violence. I don't think that I could answer the question about which city in particular, because it's quite clear to me that individuals can experience violence across the country in different circumstances. So it's more the circumstances and the nature of the violence that people experience, whether that's, as a result of migration, as a result of being engaged in sex work, as a result of their activities of illegal armed groups, whatever the circumstances may be that leads to specific experiences of violence in different areas. And sorry, just to also mention that I also met with the migration agencies in terms of getting information and data about the specific experience of Venezuelan trans migrants.
Una segunda pregunta. Usted habló de 43 miembros de la comunidad LGBTI asesinados este año, 334 el año pasado, más de 200, pero también hay más de 500, por poner un ejemplo, firmantes del acuerdo de paz que han sido asesinados en Colombia y muchísimos líderes sociales y defensores de derechos humanos. ¿Cómo un Estado como el colombiano puede detener en lo real, en la práctica, en los territorios, esta ola de violencia y de racismo?
Look, I think you point to a dilemma of the state, and that's why I say that in many senses, in many respects, this is not an easy situation to address. There are high levels of pervasive violence for a range of different reasons. And while the state can take certain steps and is certainly already put in place a lot of initiatives, and I've called on those to be better resourced. I call for more substantive engagement with civil society organizations, but it's with a recognition that that's not going to be an immediate solution to the overarching security situation in Colombia. I myself am from South Africa, and I was struck by some of the parallels that I experienced in my visit to Colombia, precisely because South Africa, too, protects, includes in the Constitution explicit protection on the basis of sexual orientation. There's exceptionally good legal and policy framework. There's also a high level of violence, a high level of gender-based violence, and a high level of violence directed against LGBT people. And those are very difficult issues to resolve because they rest on very deep-rooted social norms and practices that require a very long period in order to bring about significant change.
Una práctica, ¿hay algún otro país que tenga un fenómeno tan delicado como crítica como este, que se le puede llamar crítica en este momento?
I think every country that I visit and engage with is unique in its own way. But I've found Colombia to be a very complicated environment, and I've been very grateful to all the civil society organizations and the authorities who have given me, in this short period that I've had, insight into the nature of the challenges and the aspirations for change. But certainly, I would say Colombia has a unique set of challenges, but it also has a unique framework towards solutions to those difficulties.
I really want to change. Paula Caballero from the agency EVE. As you reported, there's a lot of discrimination through trans communities, but I haven't read anything about indigenous trans communities. So is this a further point that's going to be explored?
Yes. Yes, I do want to say that there are, I'm way over the word limits of my, which I'm in trouble for because of the translation, but definitely met directly with affected indigenous communities, trans indigenous communities, and I was very struck by the multiple challenges that they face. And also, you know, just to give you a visual illustration, in all the groups we met with, everyone wanted to have a photograph, to post on social media. It's the only group that absolutely out of the question because of the security risks that they face. And I think that's illustrative of just how vulnerable that group of people feel.
En el caso de los niños, niñas y adolescentes, evidenciaron casos específicos que les han manifestado. Infortunadamente, en algunas instituciones educativas del país, pues se evidencian casos de persecución, de hostigamiento.
Yes, I did hear about specific instances in school environments in which there was persistent bullying and experience of discrimination, notwithstanding the policy framework that is in place. And I will go into detail in that when I produce the longer report. I allude to it in this report, but I would go into more specific detail when I'm producing the longer report. It's a specific area of concern for me because of the long-term life consequences of being excluded from school. Often the discrimination starts in the family and then is perpetuated in a school environment. In fact, my report to the General Assembly this year will be on barriers to education, precisely because I see that as a key area of concern around the world, not only in Colombia.
Muchas gracias entonces por acompañarme.